All right, man, everybody got quiet, which is great. Thank you all very much. I'm so pleased that y'all are here at the Chamber. Obviously, this is an important issue, and I'm not surprised that our room is full with a lot of amazing people. We're not going to do introductions, so sometimes we have everybody in the room introduce themselves. That would take way too much time, and it would keep us away from the panel. But I do want to do one thing. You see, is it still behind me? Yes, the Coalition of East Tarrant Chambers. So I do want to mention that because I think this is probably the first meeting that we've done together. So if you look at Lori and Mary and Jack back here in the corner, they're my fellow CEOs with the Northeast Chamber, the HEB Chamber, the Mansfield Chamber, and we've all come together to advocate for our cities. And where we align, we will align. Where we don't, we won't. But the good news is, I think there's significant alignment among our chambers. And so I'm so happy that they're here today and look forward to working with them. Grapevine also is a member. Radonna couldn't be here, but Grapevine is also a member of this coalition. So thank you all for being here. I'm excited about what we're going to be able to get accomplished through that coalition. I'm going to tell you as well that we have an event coming up, and I don't always do this at the beginning, but this event is sort of on a short timetable. So amongst all your papers, there's something called Legends and Leaders. If you see that, please take a look at it. It's an event that's coming up on the 23rd. It's going to be at Texas Live. The legend is Charlie Pride, and then we're going to have Reed Cordish, one of the principals of the Cordish companies there. Great event. Please take a look at it. We have a lot of elected officials in the room. So, and again, not going to introduce, but if you're an elected official, can you please stand up and we'll give you a quick round of applause? So our format today, where we have panelists up here who I'll introduce in just a second, and each are going to have 10 minutes, maybe a little more, to do their presentation, and then we have a moderator who's going to lead us through then a discussion. So we look forward to that. Because our time is limited, though, we are not going to do questions from the audience. So it's just questions from the moderator. I'm sure people will be around here when it's done. So if you have questions you need to ask, feel free to come up and ask those questions. So our panelists, and I'm going to do this in the order that they're going to present. So Dr. Vance, again, is the director of the Center for Economic Prosperity, and he's a senior economist in the Texas Public Policy Foundation, one of the nation's premier free market think tanks. Judge Glenn Whitley presides over Tarrant County Commissioners Court. He's a leader on transportation, sustainable communities, efficient government, air quality, and education. Dr. Aaron Reich is the president of the Arlington Independent School District Board of Trustees. We were very happy just yesterday to have State of the District, and Aaron in the district are doing great work. We have our state representative, Matt Krause. He's a constitutional attorney, college professor of American history and government, and a public speaker. Matt represents District 93 in Tarrant County, which covers a portion of Fort Worth and Arlington. Maybe others, I'm not sure, but definitely Fort Worth and Arlington. And then our moderator, so if we're going to do something on property tax, I guess we ought to go get somebody who knows something about property tax. So our moderator is Ron Wright. He's the Tarrant County tax assessor and collector. He is a sixth-generation resident of Tarrant County. He served on the staff of Congressman Joe Barton from 2000 to 2011. He's also a former Arlington City Council member. Thank you all for our panelists for being here. And now I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Ginn. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Good morning. Hope you're all doing well today. It's a pleasure to be here today, and thank you for the opportunity, and Bill for the invitation as well. I was at the State of the District yesterday, and it's great to see so many good things that are going on in Arlington. I travel a lot across the state, and you don't always see that. So I really commend you all for what you're doing here in Arlington. I thought it was a great presentation yesterday. Can I just click this forward? Good question. It is not. There we go. So, as I said, I'm Dr. Vance again. I live in Round Rock. I have a 4-year-old and a 9-month-old, and so they'll soon be going to school. So it's something that I'm really interested in as well, to make sure that we have a bright future for them. I taught at Sam Houston State University for a couple years and really enjoyed that, and I've been at the foundation now for 5 years and done a lot of work on school finance, on property tax reform, a number of other areas out there. So the Texas Public Policy Foundation is a 501c3 nonprofit, nonpartisan, free market think tank down in Austin. I don't claim Austin. I live in Round Rock for a number of reasons. One of those being property taxes being so high. So one of the things that I look at as an economist is that institutions really matter. Just a quick overview, kind of where I come from in my line of research is really looking at how institutions matter for us. And even in our own personal lives, the institutions that you went through, whether it be schooling, single-parent household like I did, with a dad who had epilepsy growing up, and my parents were divorced when I was 5, and I had the opportunity to go to a private school from kindergarten to 2nd grade, public school from 3rd grade to 6th grade, and homeschool from 7th grade through 12th grade, because as we were moving and everything else, it helped me to meet my unique needs. I went to a junior college and then went on to Texas Tech. And so when you think about this, in the economic literature, going back all the way to Adam Smith, Frederick von Hayek, Milton Friedman, and so forth, there's really what's called extractive institutions versus inclusive institutions. And you kind of get an idea of that, but extractive institutions are those that redistribute income and resources from one to another, and inclusive institutions are those that allow you kind of to live most freely, where you have capitalism. And so when I look at Texas and try to compare it with other states, to kind of give you an economic picture here, these institutions really do matter. Texas and Florida, when you look at economic freedom of North America, which measure government spending, taxation, and regulation, Texas and Florida rank second most free. They tie most free in the nation. California and New York are the bottom two. So the ones that are in blue here, dark blue, those are the ones that rank best in each one of these categories. And the red are those that rank the worst in each one of these categories. And so you can kind of go through, state and local spending burden. We've got a pretty low one compared to places like California and New York. There's the employment to population ratio, 25 to 54-year-olds. We rank pretty high there as our economy continues to expand. What's kind of interesting about all this is even if you look at income inequality, top 10% of income earners, how much of a share of income they have for all the total personal income in the state, Texas ranks pretty high. Actually, well, not high. We rank better than these other states that are there in comparable rankings. And so I think what this really shows, right, is the American dream isn't dead. It's just moved to Texas, right? It just continues to move to Texas. As we're doing something right, whenever you think about our economic advantages that we have out there in these more inclusive institutions, but we still have challenges, right? And that's one of the reasons why we're here today. At the Texas Public Policy Foundation, we have what's called the Texas Prosperity Promise, which is really on 5 key pillars, one of those being doing something about property taxes. I'll talk about in a minute, maybe eliminating half the property tax burden in Texas. But we need some sort of reform, because when you go across the state, whether you're here in Arlington or elsewhere, the number one thing on a lot of taxpayers' mind are property taxes. And what do we do with that? Education reform, going to a student-centered funding, where we really look at these funding formulas, which I'll get into in a little bit, are very complicated and convoluted, and something needs to be done about those as well. We've long been in favor of education freedom and a couple of other areas that are there. But when you look at, so let's really get into what's happening today. When you look at property taxes, we have the 6th most burdensome property tax system or overall burden in the nation. And this is a report from the Tax Foundation, which shows that why people are upset. And, when you look at businesses wanting to come to Texas, there's a lot of good reason to come to Texas. No personal income tax, I think, being one of them. But property taxes continue to be one of their highest things that they'll report as being a problem in Texas. I was just looking at the Chamber of Commerce across the state, and some of the major issues they looked at was on the educated workforce as being an issue, right? And also taxes was another key issue that was up there. And so whenever I first want to talk, when I want to look at taxes, the first thing I want to look at is spending, right? Because spending is what drives taxes and debt. When you think about it, taxes just don't come out of nowhere. First, you decide what you want to spend money on and why, and then you determine, okay, well, how are we going to pay for it? And let's make sure that we pay for it the most efficient way possible, and look at the different tax systems that you could have. Income tax, well, we know if you tax income, you get less labor, right? You get less work and less economic activity. The similar thing is if you tax property, which is capital, right? You get less capital, less property. And going back to even Adam Smith in The Wealth of Nations, talked about capital formation and accumulation as being what brings about the wealth of nations. And so it's one of the problems that you could have with taxing property is that you slow down economic growth. So when you look at state spending over time since 2004-05, one metric that you can use to compare it with is population growth and inflation. It's a common thing in the economic literature to look at, and even in financial work, public finance as well. And the current state budget is $217 billion, all right? And so what this line does at the bottom, it shows how the state's overall budget would grow if it increased by population plus inflation. So if you look at that overall gap here, we're spending $15 billion more than we otherwise would have as a state if we just match population plus inflation. And what that means is that the average family of four in Texas just this year is spending $1,000 more in taxes than they otherwise would be. So it's important to look at that and see where are those dollars going. And as all of you know, right, a big part of the budget is education spending. The other big one is healthcare. Those are the two main areas that we were looking at. Aaron and I were just talking about, school finance is so complex. Medicaid is also very complex. Fortunately or unfortunately, I get to work on both of those. It makes it kind of fun. There's so many moving parts in there. And so when we look at school finance, one of the things that we really like to look at the foundation is that whether it's coming from the state or local dollars, it's all coming from taxpayers. Taxpayers is where this comes from. We call this infographic Edward Faucet hands. Y'all remember Edward Scissorhands? This is Edward Faucet hands, how the dollars flow. And so it really starts, though, with the state determining the school finance formulas. And those are based on a number of factors. Lower income folks, non-English speaking, there's a number of indices that are there, and you take those calculations, and then it spits out a number of how much we're going to fund per student, right? And so that overall bucket is then determined by the state-determined funding formulas. And then what you have are local property tax dollars that come in and first fill in the bucket, and then the state fills in the rest of the bucket, whatever was left over. And so where really it goes in first is local property taxes, which is one reason why I'm here today to talk about local property taxes and what we need to do in order to control those more over time and the growth rate while still sufficiently funding education over time. And so when you look at it, and there's been a lot of discussion about, well, the state share has been reduced. And so this is information compared over time. This is information from the Texas Education Agency that actually shows that the state's portion of school finance went from 34.7% in fiscal year 2007 to 36.4%. So it's actually increased. There's been an increase in state funding overall when you look at the numbers. And this is from the Texas Education Agency. And so the idea that the state just needs to fund more and that will lower property taxes, not only are local property taxes going first, so that doesn't influence the property taxes, which are determined at the local level, but also the state's portion has continued to increase. And actually it's increased whenever you look at the growth rate based on per student spending and even inflation-adjusted dollars. So this is fiscal year 2006, and the red line shows per student spending and inflation-adjusted dollars, and it's actually up a little bit over time. For some of the numbers that I've looked at, it's up 7.6%. Since 04-05 school year. So there's been an increase in spending per student, and the share going towards from the state's also been increasing. So I think it's important to look at the overall picture of where these dollars are coming from and how we can really take a bite out of property taxes. And I think part of it is, we need to think about how we can spend these dollars more wisely. From 1993 to 2015, student enrollment increased by 48%, okay? Teachers increased by 56%, so there's some direct correlation there. But you also see non-teaching staff, administration, aides, other sort of staff that are in the schools increased by 66%. Now, there's a number of reasons for that. Some of those are mandates by the federal government. Some of those are mandates by the state. But some of those are just in 1 or 2 years you had a pretty stark increase that should have been smoothed out over time. We're talking about a 22-year period. So all of that can't explain everything of the larger increase of 66%. If that 66% increase had been the same rate as student enrollment of 48%, teachers could have had an increase on average of about $6,000 more in benefits, or $2.2 billion in savings that maybe could have been lower property taxes. So it's something to keep in mind. I'm not here to say maybe there's good reason for this, but I just think that it's really important for school districts as you're looking at the budgets, and Arlington seems to be doing a pretty good job of this, but make sure that every dollar, and we were talking earlier, zero-based budgeting that y'all use here, that's fantastic. I hope maybe that's a template that we can use other places, because not everyone does that across the state. Because look, we do have some questionable uses of this. I'm sure y'all have seen this. In La Jolla ISD, they recently built a water park. To me, I'm not so sure that that's what ISD money should be used for myself. In my homeschool, I didn't have a water park. Maybe I should have. But you know, there's $11.8 billion in reserves of ISDs across the state, which basically equals our rainy day fund. And so as you're raising property taxes, there's also this reserve funds that are there. So, you know, why not use some of that money as well? Just something else to think about. And then there's $127 billion in school district debt across the state. A lot of those going to facilities. We saw a lot of those facilities yesterday at the State of the District that are here in Arlington ISD. But just something else I wanted to kind of throw out there. And so we've had chances in the past, or what would you call it? They've taken attempts to lower property taxes. When you go back to 1997, under the Bush, Governor Bush, there was a way to raise the homestead exemption by $10,000 to lower property taxes. Well, what do you think happened? Property taxes didn't go down. School districts' property taxes continued to go up, and even total property taxes continued to go up. And so what happened was appraisals just went up, right? And the property taxes that were paid by businesses went up, because that only affected residential and people who had a homestead, okay? So that didn't work. And then we had the 2005, the Supreme Court said that the school finance system was unconstitutional based on our property taxes, as most school districts were reaching up toward the cap the state had set. And so in 2006, they did this property tax swap with the school, the franchise tax, made it the margins tax, which is a horrible tax, gross receipt style tax. But again, school district taxes went down 1 year, $2.1 billion. But then the very next year, it was up again by $3 billion, right? So there really wasn't very much. It was very temporary overall property tax relief, if you will. And then in 2015, the most recent one, they raised the homestead exemption again by $10,000. And you might guess it, property taxes didn't go down, not even for the school districts. And so these failed attempts have given us some reason to say, look, we need another opportunity to really provide real property tax relief in the state. One of those is maybe this 2.5% trigger that the governor's talked about. We've kind of long been in favor of lowering the threshold for automatic rollback elections to happen. And when you look at the growth rates over time from 1996 to 2016, average annual change for special districts is 8.2%, county 6.6%, city 6.3%, school districts 5.8%. So maybe that's also a way to at least slow the growth rate in property taxes. But the problem with that is it doesn't provide real property tax relief. People want to see their property taxes go down, right? Not just slow the growth rate over time, which that would do. So we've been looking at the foundation is to limit government spending at the state level to 4%. And if you can lower it to 4%, then that would allow you over time to buy down property taxes permanently just for school district, just for school maintenance and operation. You know, some say that the state share of education spending has been declining. Well, this would actually be a way to get us all the way to 100% state share of funding, to where you could eliminate half the property tax in Texas. Right? We're just kind of trying to come up with different options that we can really look at here. And what we could do if we could limit state spending, the last decade, revenue growth increased at 10% over a biennial period, 2-year budget cycle in the state. You can use that 6% delta then to use state surplus dollars to buy down the property tax every period until it's eliminated, which could take about 11 years. So institutions matter. Pass another conservative budget, strengthen state spending limit. So government spending is ultimately paid for by taxation. So we really should look at limiting government spending, and that will help us to be able to lower property taxes over time. Thank you for your time. There's my information. Look forward to the question and answer afterwards. Thank you.
Introduction too long.
Oh, I have no idea what he's talking about. All right, so, advance. Okay, so there we go. So I'm going to share, can you all hear me okay? And I can't believe I just said y'all. I'm going to have to tell my wife that. I've refused to say that my entire 27 or so years in Texas. I guess I'm an official Texan. So it took me long enough, right? So what I want to present is the ISD perspective. Property tax, of course, is a big concern. It's something we get our tax bills, we go, oh my gosh, they're going up. They're always going up. What are we going to do? And then you look at the ISD portion, oh my gosh, I'm paying so much into the school. So there's some misnomers there that the general public isn't fully aware of, and it's one of the things that the main takeaway that I want to clear up today for you. So the property tax versus property valuations, two very different things, and that's one of the things that we need to talk about. As far as in our finance system, our finance formulas, there's essentially two sources of revenue, and it's state aid and property taxes. The way it is supposed to happen is that our property taxes, unlike, say, counties and cities, where they have a rate and those dollars go right to the counties and cities, and I know Judge Whitley will be discussing that perspective. ISDs, our dollars go to the state, and the state splits it up and divvies it up. And what you have is essentially an inverse relationship. As the property values increase, the state aid decreases. And I'll have some examples to show you. But essentially, what that means is you see that tax bill, you see that ISD bill, and you think, oh my gosh, well, Arlington ISD isn't realizing all of that. The way the formulas are set up, and it's really based on the formulas need fixing. So a portion goes, well, it all goes to the state. It's then divvied back up, and the data that I have to show is a little bit different than Vance. Essentially, some of the concern that we have is that, oh, okay, I'm sorry, my slides are different than what you're seeing here. So here's just a quick graphic of what I was explaining. As the local property values go up, the state aid goes down. So what that means is Arlington ISD, all of us here that are paying the school property tax portion of your tax bill to Arlington ISD, those dollars are not going back. You're not spending it in Arlington. It's going to the state. Some of it is coming back to Arlington, but the key takeaway is it's not all of it, and it's a kind of a complex system. So again, it's an inverse relationship. The other thing is the formulas don't contain any adjustments for inflation. And so yes, if you look over time, the spend has gotten more. But the spend has gotten more because costs go up in our homes, in our businesses, utilities, energy, goods, products. The cost goes up. It's just a standard fact in our country. So there's a lot that needs to be factored in from that perspective. And I'm sorry I have to go back and forth because I don't know where the transitions are here. So property wealth, the impact on state aid is also something to consider. Most of you in this room are probably pretty familiar with Robin Hood, and the idea behind Robin Hood was to try to help property poor districts from the property wealthy districts. And so if you look essentially at this as an example, the tier 1 is part of the formula, the basic allotment from the state as far as what we would receive. So say in Arlington ISD, and these are actual dollars from our state allotment, $414.6 million. Our local taxable property value is $23.3 billion. And the $1 tax levy, that's $233 million, is what our local share and our part of the pie is to contribute to the budget. The state share of that Tier 1 is $181 million, and that was 17-18. If you look at an example for a property wealthy district, the way it works, you see the Tier 1, that allotment's the same, right? That hasn't changed. The local taxable property value, though, let's say the value is instead of $23.3 billion, they're $45 billion. So our local share then at that $1 calculation is $450 million. Therefore, it is more than that basic allotment number. Therefore, the state share is 0. Any excess over that is that property wealthy's district contribution to help property poor districts. And that's something that's in concept. Initially, it was controversial. It's proven to not be a very fair system for property rich and property poor districts because the shares, it just doesn't equate. And I'll explain a little bit more. So again, as local property values rise, the school district's share of funding increases. That's the main takeaway here. Tax rate, that's one thing, and I'll go into that as well because ISDs were essentially already beholden to a tax rate and a cap. So what happens, the state actually does save money because what is happening is out of that big tax bill, number one, it's not going to Arlington ISD, all of it. Number two, it's not necessarily going to education. And as Vance said, there is two big buckets, the biggest buckets in our state. It's education and it's healthcare. But we have to have transparency for our citizens to understand that those dollars are not actually going to education. And when it comes to appropriations time, they go elsewhere. And I'll give you some numbers here in just a second. So here's the impact, just to put it more in context for you. So this was the graphic of the 17-18 year. Here is the 18-19. Does this have a pointer? Oh, there we go. That's a lot easier. Okay, so let's look at a comparison here where the allotment, let's say it's exactly the same. Our student growth hasn't changed. Our enrollment, which is how the funding formulas are based, doesn't change whatsoever. So if you look at our prior year value of $23.3 billion, and then fast forward this next year, it goes to $25.755 billion, which are actually, I believe, those are actual certified values, right, Ms. Powell? I have our CFO of the school district here is one of the best minds in the state on all of this. So what essentially happens here, our local share goes up, $257.5 million. The state share is $157. So the only thing that's changed, the numbers haven't, the amount of children, everything stays the same, but the property valuation has increased. And the result is we, at the local level, local ISD, receive less dollars. Nobody, for the most part, understands that. And we have to put that out there. I would submit to you, let's, at a minimum, have real transparency and show on our tax bills so that consumers understand, our citizens understand that here's X percent that goes to local as far as the school district, and here's the X percent that goes to the state. And that's not even getting into the discussion of those extra dollars that are not funneled back into education. So that's something to consider. Here's the example. When the funding formula was set up in 2008, the design was a 50-50. It was supposed to be kind of an even split. We were doing our part, the state was doing their part. You look, this is the numbers now. The state share is 43% in 2017 versus the local burden, 57%. 2018, 38% at the state level, 62% local burden. So, and this is property wealthy, property poor districts. It's all in the same situation. The more the values go up, the less dollars overall that the state necessarily has to put into public education. Why? Because it doesn't go to an education fund, it goes to the general fund. And so when it comes time to appropriations, that money is just in a big pot. It's not necessarily directed towards education. As you know, there was a school finance lawsuit because districts said, we've got to do something. And in Arlington, we're all about not throwing money at a problem, all right? But the formulas are set up in such a way where there really are issues. So I'll give you an example. The allotments. In that Tier 1 formula, there's a number of different allotments. I use transportation as the example. Transportation allotment was put into place in 1984. Has not changed. That amount has not changed. So what does that mean for Arlington ISD? Yeah, sure, we get an allotment. It's $2.8 million. What is our cost in Arlington ISD for transportation? It's between $10 and $11 million. So it's part of the formula. I have 5 minutes left. Is that right, Bill? Thank you. So that's, and there's other allotments that are like that. And then there's mandates that are not necessarily funded that lead to additional costs. There's other costs as far as salaries and raises, and I'll get into all that in just a minute. The point is, districts got together and said something's got to give. These formulas are just, they're not working, and that's really the thing. The Supreme Court said, you know what, the formulas are constitutional. Technically, they meet the standard. But, and to use their words, they said it's a Byzantine system. This is archaic. There does need to be something happening. And they didn't mandate the legislature to do anything, but they did say, we strongly encourage you to work on the finance formula. So if you go and look at, as I mentioned, as far as property tax, we have essentially, we're capped, well, effectively at $1.04 right now. That's where Arlington ISD is and where it has been for a long time. By state law, you, on your M&O tax rate, you can go up to 117, but anything over $1.04, you have to have an election for, TRE, tax ratification election. And you'll see 44% of the districts have a rate at 104, 52% above 104. And here's a graphic from the state, I believe TEA data, that shows that 450 districts have adopted a $1.04 rate. 399 districts have already gone up to that maximum. And I don't know why. I'm not in those districts. I know that every local municipality, every local community have their own set of circumstances. And they may have a set of circumstances that requires their dollars and their taxes to be, their rate to be up that high. It could be that. It could be that maybe they're not spending as efficiently or effectively. I don't know. All I can speak to really is Arlington ISD, and I know we're doing amazing things. So the legislature tried, but it didn't happen for the 85th session. And I'm sure Matt can talk about those days, as he's lived through them very well. Essentially, with the share, under the school finance formulas, there's essentially for the 18-19 year, $3.5 billion that is essentially expected as savings to the state, not coming back. When looking the covering cost of enrollment growth, the state still has $1.5 billion more revenue. That's the reality. The state has more revenue, and it's coming from that ISD portion of your tax bill. But it's not coming back to ISDs because there's only so much money in the pot at the state level. So that's the honest discussion that we all have to have. Essentially what happened was not much. There wasn't, there were budgets proposed, there was finance ideas proposed. It didn't happen. It just didn't work. The only thing that happened was that they authorized a public school finance commission. We should have results from that commission by the end of the year. The reality on that, I don't think anything's going to come out of it. A lot of people advocated, let's have a conversation, but as happens sometimes, we have the D's and the R's that have different ideologies, and the committee makeup is to maybe be called in question, and at the end of the day, it was a good show, but nothing really came of it. I really think that's what's going to happen, but I'll be surprised. And so quickly, just to give you an idea for Arlington in our context, there was the projection is valuations are going to increase. That's what we're prosperous that way, right? Our property values, we want strong economy. We love Texas. We love to have our values grow. When it comes to ISDs, that's not necessarily a strong thing under the current system. Arlington ISD's payroll, out of our total budget of $530 million, 530.4, 464.8 is payroll. Okay, so, and Bill's yelling at me to stop. So, what I'll say in closing, that there's inflation, there's costs. We have so many other factors involved in the cost of a budget. Being very fiscally minded is one thing. Talking about property tax reform, it sounds great. And sure, I'd like to see that too on the surface. But for an ISD, we're already capped. And we're running out of options, quite honestly. The district has done a great job in taking the amount of dollars and putting it efficiently and effectively into programs for student achievement and student growth. And just the final nod here, the facilities. So we have our Career Tech Center. We don't have a water park, and that seems surprising to me. I don't know what that's about. It doesn't seem to make sense, but I'm not in that local jurisdiction. I don't know if there's some kind of a working relationship between the city and the school district, and the city said, hey, could you help us with this? There might be something there more. I don't know. On the surface, it looks kind of silly, but I really don't know that situation. What I do know is in Arlington, we effectively, with the voters' approval, put in things like a Career Tech Center that is a game changer for generations to come, focusing on workforce development and readiness. So Bill's really yelling at me to stop. See, that's what happens. So he's not an elected official. The three of us are, so just beware. All right. So thank you. Thank you very much. I'll just zoom through these. There you go, sir. Is that? Okay,
No.
I guess that's a transition.
There we go.
There you go.
There's mine. You've seen a lot of numbers. You're going to see a lot more. You got a bean counter up here who loves to talk about numbers. And so as we go through this, you'll see different numbers, and you'll see, well, wait a minute, I think that was the same. Trust me, you're going to see a lot of numbers. The sky is falling. The sky is not falling. To listen to some of our state leaders, you would believe that as local elected officials, that we're the most liberal, overspending folks that you've ever seen. And so what I want to do is talk a little bit about property taxes we're going to get into, because that's what we're here for today. But overall, when you look at Texas and you look at the amount of local and state revenue we capture per capita, we're 29. Now, you see different numbers. Again, I say, and I'll talk a little bit about that, but these numbers came from the National Association of Counties. And as you look at that, what I think is important to remember is that most states have what we call a three-legged stool. And the three legs to that stool are property tax, state income tax, and sales tax. In Texas, we don't have that leg called a state income tax, and I pray we never will. But that does mean then that the property tax and the sales tax are probably going to be a little bit higher when you look at that. Okay, let's talk about the property tax. And that seems to be the easy one for everybody to point, because first off, only local elected officials, only local entities collect property tax. Now, you've just heard the state's a partner in that property tax collection with the school districts. But as far as the cities and the counties go, they're not. I'm saying that we're 14th. Vance had a 6% number up there, or number 6 number up there, but it's important to remember that that was only in terms of owner-occupied housing. Well, that's not the only property tax that we collect. So you really need to look at the overall part of the deal. Sales tax, we're number 10. Be careful, because the more you mess with these two, the more chance you take of this one popping up its ugly head. And so we need to talk about these taxes, but we need to talk about them in terms of we like them. We just got to figure out how we balance them and make it so that everybody is paying some share of it. Well, I don't want to even begin to try to get into fair share. I just want to talk about, where we are. And I think that one of the things you've also got to look at, we've talked a lot about appraised value and the increase in appraised value. And when I hear that term, I think, well, that's my house. The appraised value of my house has gone up. But don't forget that when you look at the total appraised value this year and you compare it to next, there's this little thing in there called new construction. And when you're the number one state for year after year after year in the economy, guess what happens? There's going to be a little bit of new construction going there. So that increase in burden, whether you talk about a 230% increase in levy or you talk whatever it is, you need to dig down a little bit deeper and find out how much of that is new construction and how much of it is appreciation on an existing business or an existing home. Okay, now let's talk about property taxes, because that is something that we're all interested in, and I truly believe that there needs to be an open dialogue with the state and with all the local entities to sit down and talk about what we can do. And some of the things that I have mentioned up here is, let's look at some of the current exemptions. Here's our little spreadsheet on the TAD, from the TAD that we got for Tarrant County. The first line says appraised value, $228 billion. The estimated net taxable value after all these exemptions and after the protests and everything else is $186 billion. There's $42 billion that for whatever reason are not being taxed. And so one of the things that I would just suggest that the legislature might do is let's look at those exemptions. We've talked about sales tax. We have to be careful about sales tax. But remember that with the sales tax burden we've got right now, as I said earlier, we're number 10. And that's in collections. Now the rates, we may be higher or we may be lower in the rates, but we're looking again at collections. And again, remember, the reason we're talking about property taxes, how many times a year do you pay property taxes? Well, you pay it every month if you got an escrow. If you're paying it, you may be paying it once a year, or you may be paying it twice a year. And Ron is glad to accept that money. But because you write it, you see a pretty big number, as opposed to the thousands or tens of thousands of times that you buy something and pay a little bit of sales tax. Well, that little bit of sales tax grows. And so, again, it's easy to focus on property taxes, one, because you see a big number, and two, because, well, it's all those local elected officials that are collecting that property tax. We could shift and allow, and again, that breaks the cap, and you and I have talked about this. We've talked about shifting some of our property tax and allowing counties to actually charge and collect sales tax. A penny of sales tax in Tarrant County, 1 penny of sales tax in Tarrant County would raise approximately $270 million a year. Our 24.4 cents of property tax raises about $360 million a year. And it's going to be a little bit more this year, but we're going to reduce the rate. I feel very confident that we start our budget hearings on Monday. We've reduced our rate by a penny the last 2 years, and I think we're going to reduce it by a penny again this third year. So let us consider letting us have a little bit of sales tax or have an option. For us, it's a great thing because we've got this great city called Arlington that generates an awful lot of visitors coming into this area. And I hear the mayor always talk about OPM. And Arlington people know what OPM, that's other people's money. And they get a lot of other people's money from even within the state. But when you look around the state, we're all visitors, we're a tourist state. People come here and spend their money. And it would not hurt me at all to take some of those New Yorkers' money and use it for our stuff down here. So the other thing that I think we can look at is that if the state would become a 50-50 partner in the maintenance and operations. Now again, when you see numbers like, I know one of the numbers that was used was an $11 billion number, and that was all funding. And you gotta be careful about that, because all funding includes that little thing called INS, or capital. It's those facilities and things like that. And folks, when you see a number over there, you know how that number got over there? And if not, I think almost 99% of the time, you voted on it. You said, I want that water park. Now, I agree. I don't understand why that water park is there, but I'll tell you that when I sat on the HEB board, we had this little park around Bell High School, and it had a track. And we redid that track and made it, really improve that track. And we did that because in talking with the city of Hearst, they said, do you realize how many seniors and how many of our citizens come up and run around that track every night, every day? So some of that may be done in partnership to make it available for all of the citizens. And I love those kind of collaborations because it says we're not going to both go out and do something, we're going to do something together. So if they were becoming a 50-50 partner in just M&O, again, we're talking about spending caps. Well, that doesn't reduce it, it just holds the growth back. If they would be a 50-50 partner, we could reduce that line called ISD property taxes by 15%. And you know how big that line is, and 15% is a lot. Review purchases and services currently not subject to sales tax. Again, we're talking about two types of taxes, a property tax and a sales tax. We're not going to solve our problem by looking at just one. We're going to have to look at both of them, and that's what the legislature, I think, and hope will do. And I really believe that the school funding thing is broke. When I was on the HEB school board, it was right after Robin Hood was started. And you're right when we say that, okay, we try to do something, but because we got the #1 economy and everything's growing, then by the time we get to the next year, the appraisals, the new construction, everything that's happening has caught up with it. And so we've got to figure out a new formula. And I hope that we do that by coming together with local leaders and not pointing fingers and saying we're the problem. We need to sit down around a table and talk about these things and not stand next to an old truck and point to us and say, you got to get on with it. We need to stop unfunded mandates. Last session of the legislature, the House, by over a 2/3 vote, voted to do that. It went to the Senate, didn't even get a hearing. Okay, I got to move. Unfunded mandates. What are an unfunded mandate? That's what affects us. So as we're sitting here today, Catherine's home is broken into. Now, they got a great Arlington Police Department. They catch that individual before he gets away. But then he's put into jail and he says, I can't afford an attorney. Well, the state in 2000 said, counties, you hire the attorney, you pay the attorney, we'll reimburse you. 2001 came, so we did it out of our reserves. 2001 came along. Well, we can't reimburse you the full dollar, we'll reimburse you about 10 cents. And so local taxpayers got to pick up the burden on that deal. Over the life, we've now put in $2.7 billion. Y'all have put in $2.7 billion all over the state, and it was over 14 last year for Tarrant County alone. Next example. Well, here are the states. Now, they said they were going to fully fund it. The ones in red fully fund indigent defense, 27 of them. So it can be done, it is being done. State prisoners. That guy is tried, he goes through the system, he's convicted, he's ready to go to the state penitentiary, paper ready, but they don't pick him up. And so as local taxpayers, you get to pay for their room and board and hope that they don't get sick because you get to pay for that too. Or you've got somebody who's on parole and they violate that parole and they're picked up and they're put in our jail. Week in July, average daily, a number of state prisoners that we had was 134. Easy math. 134 times $60 a day is what we're told that it's cost to hold them, times 365 days, 2.9 million for Tarrant County alone, over 100 million for the state. Local decision making. You've heard a lot of stuff about this, but that's what it's all about. You start talking about caps, you start talking about different things like that. In effect, what you're talking about is taking the decision making away from your local elected officials. You'll hear, well, we created them, we can do away with them. Well, when the federal government was created, it was because 13 states got together and said, we think there's certain times when the federal government needs to do it. And then when the states got together and when they started looking locally, they said, you know, the best decisions are going to be made locally by the people who they're going to impact. And they're going to impact cities, and they're going to impact counties, and they're going to impact school districts. So we're the ones that need to be doing that. And when you cripple us, and when you tie our hands with a 2.5% cap, then what you're going to do, and you can hear it from, there's TML that basically says 2.5% is going to cripple us. Here's the Perryman report. Perryman report says we're number one in business. You know, all the stuff that we've done, the increase in appraisals, all that stuff has not stopped us from continuing to be number one. What Perryman says might be the problem that's going to stop us is the fact that we're not producing a well-educated workforce. So we need to look and we need to focus on that. You tie the cities to 2.5%, they will not be able to offer the developers the incentives to come into this area. What does that mean? Next year's 30 years for the parole for the Alliance. Over that 30 years, there was incentives for tax incentives, there's been TIFs, there's been abatements. Over that period of time, that area has paid over $2 billion in property taxes. Viridian, for you here in Arlington, how many times did people try to develop that area and fail? And now, because of assistance with the county and with the city stepping in there, we've got a magnificent development. And oh, by the way, we've got a developer down there who's really committed to the community. And by us doing those things and asking those incentives and offering those incentives, we're able to bring people in and really get the right people in to be able to get this done. You hear population and inflation, and we're going to use statewide averages. Well, statewide average, we're growing, but we're not growing near as fast on the state basis when you look at overall from the state as we are if you look at the major urban areas. We're adding 1,000, he's telling me to stop, we're adding 1,000 people a day to this North Texas area. 1,000 people a day. That's over 1 million people every 3 years. So we need to be able to keep local control, and if you don't like what we're doing, vote us out of office.
Thanks, Judge. And, you know, the benefit of going last is that everybody said everything that you probably were going to say. The con is they've done the exact same thing. So instead of rehashing all that, I'll just kind of maybe hit on some of the points that each of the presenters have made and just kind of give it from a state perspective. This is a great conversation to have. We need to be having it because, in my opinion, I kind of look at this like jobs and the economy at the federal level. I don't know about you, but it always makes me a little nervous when a president of either party gets up and says, I've created 1 million jobs, or I will create so many jobs if I'm in office. Well, for me, it's not the job of the president of the federal government to create the jobs. It's the job of the government to create an environment where those jobs will come, where the economy can flourish, where everything can thrive. I kind of feel like that's the state's role in what we're doing with property taxes. It's not our job to lower the tax rates, to set them, to do all that. Hopefully it's to create an environment where property taxes can be lowered, our local ISDs can have all the money they need, the local counties are doing the job that they're supposed to do. Again, it's our job to create that environment. And I think Vance hit on it in his presentation, is when we try to step in and we try to fix the problem, we only make it worse, right? And in 2015, I remember we voted on a $2 billion tax relief package to increase the homestead exemption. Well, what did that do? That gave everybody in Texas, every homeowner, a benefit of about $53 to $57. And if I were to ask any of you to raise your hand if you experienced that tax relief, I don't think anybody would raise their hand because we talked about rising appraisals and everything. It just swallowed it up. You didn't even notice that. And here's one other thing. When we spend that $2 billion to increase the homestead exemption, it wasn't just for that biennium. We are now on the hook as a state to continue to put in that $2 billion every biennium in perpetuity going forward to keep that homestead exemption where it is. So that shows kind of the futility of looking towards the state to have as much to buy down that property taxes and buy it down and buy it down. It's just not what it's not our jurisdiction. It's not what we're capable of doing because as Judge Whitley said, local entities are the ones who bring that in, who take those taxes, who collect all those monies. And so it's really for them to set the rates and to be able to bring it in. It's for us to create that environment where it can happen. I did think Vance made some good points on education spending and what we're spending per student and how that's actually increased year after year, biennium after biennium. We're not having a shortage of education funding to keep up with population and inflation and growth in our schools. We just need to make sure we're using that money more efficiently and effectively. And Arlington ISD does a great job of that. We've had many conversations. Cindy and I sat down with Scott, our district director, just a couple of weeks ago talking about that. And if everybody followed the model of Arlington ISD, then we wouldn't be having a lot of these conversations. And the same goes true for Judge Whitley in Tarrant County. And I was sitting down with a bunch of mayors kind of up in the northeast part of Tarrant County a couple of weeks ago. Sometimes down in the legislature, we paint with a pretty broad brush, and I know we do that. And so if some of these bigger cities are misbehaving or acting out, we kind of characterize everybody, every local government, local entity is doing that. So we create legislation that pushes back against that or seeks to right that wrong. Well, sometimes some cities, some counties, some local ISDs are actually doing a really good job. And I think what we need to do is have that collaborative conversation to make sure we're recognizing those folks are doing good, penalize or work with those people who aren't doing as good, and that's how we need to balance things. You talked about, Dr. Reich talked about the inverse relationship. As property values go up, the share of the state's money for local ISD goes down. And I know that's a source of frustration for a lot of people, but you kind of have to see it from the state perspective as well. As raising appraisal values go up, okay, that's a lot more money that those people in that local ISD have to spend money on that local ISD, because we've got rising healthcare costs that are going crazy for us. We've got increased transportation needs that we could use some of that general revenue money for. We've got healthcare, not only healthcare, but water and other infrastructure needs that we could use that for. So that's kind of the cost benefit analysis at the state level is, yes, those raising appraisal values are really good. And if they need this set of money and they're getting 60% of that money from rising appraisals instead of 50%, then we can use that other money somewhere else. So you may not agree with it, but that's kind of the thinking from the state is we've got so many other areas where we have to spend this money. If we don't have to spend it here, we can definitely use it over there. Dr. Reich said something else that's endemic in government. You said Robin Hood was intended to help. And how many things in government do we do that are intended to help? My college basketball coach used to always tell me, he said, don't mistake activity for achievement, right? And so many times in government, we do something. We just do something to be active, but it doesn't actually achieve anything at the end of the day. And so actually, Texas Public Policy Foundation, Vance and his team have put together an amazing proposal to get rid of Robin Hood, and maybe we can go into that a little bit more later on or ask him about that. But you're right, that's one of those things in government that was intended to do good, but it didn't. And so we need to figure out a way to correct that. And it's one of those tensions that's always going to be there, right? The property-rich districts are always going to want to keep the money that they have in their local ISD to pay for that education. The property-poor districts are always going to want a little bit of help and need a little bit of help from around the state. So there's always going to be that tension there, and we have to figure out which way we're going to go. And I think that may be one of the issues with the School Finance Commission that we've talked about. I tend to agree with you. I don't know if we're going to come out with any bold, groundbreaking proposals. I know Senator Hancock has been on record talking a lot about how we just need to basically raise it to the ground and build it from the start up. Because I'm sure you know with the school finance formula, we've got all these patches, right? And okay, this is a problem here. It's kind of like poking your fingers in the dam that's leaking. Is that, okay, we need to do this. Okay, now we need to do this. Okay, now there's one over here. And we've patched up so many things, it's almost swallowed up the original formulas that we've had. So I agree we need to raise it down to the ground and build it back up from start, because it's very inequitable right now. And one thing I think we have to do is we have to make it fluid. We have to make it flexible. When you're a fast growth school district, sometimes you need access to a little bit more capital. You have a little bit more needs for a certain period of time, so you're not a fast growth school district anymore. And you should have that flexibility just in terms of how we educate our kids and what you're doing with the Career Tech Center. I think we need to look at that, incentivizing that, and making sure, hey, maybe you need to get a little more funds if you're doing the job of actually making kids not only college ready, but career ready as they're coming out of high school. So I think our funding formulas need to look at that and not just be so static, so set in place from a decade ago, and that's how we're building our formula. As Dr. Reich said, constitutional. The Supreme Court said our funding formulas were constitutional, but that doesn't mean they're good. And I think there's a lot of people down in Austin that recognize that as well, and that's one of the reasons we set the committee. We're having all these hearings, but we need to do something more. Just because it's constitutional doesn't mean that it's good. And another thing Dr. Rush touched on is we need to have transparency and the truth in budgeting, right? When we take that money and the state says, hey, since you're going to use this, since you have so much more money over here, we're actually going to use some of the other money that you used to get for general revenue. I think we need to have that conversation and make sure that that's transparent to the taxpayer, right? If we've got money that's earmarked for education, that money needs to go to education. That money needs to go to the local ISDs. If we want to have the conversation to say, hey, we actually think we could use this money a little better for healthcare funding or transportation or water or some other thing, we need to have that conversation and put that out and be transparent about that, because whether it's roads, whether it's education, whatever it is, if we said our money should be going there, it should be going there, just as a matter of honesty and transparency in what we're doing. And finally, on the School Finance Commission, one more reason that you brought up, that I don't know if we have a defining ideology of what the goal is to come out of this commission. And I think until we figure out what the actual goal is, because you got different people on the commission with different perspectives and different thoughts, which is all well and good, but if you've got all these different competing ideas of what the end goal should be, I don't know how you're ever actually going to get to something comprehensive that everybody can agree on. So I think we need to even have a much larger conversation about education, its goals, its ideology, before we can even fix the school finance part. And Judge Whitley talked about shifting the burden from property tax to sales tax. We actually worked on a bill together in the special session last year where it would allow counties and cities to eliminate their portion of the property tax for an increased sales tax. And we ran the numbers for Travis County, for Bexar County, for Harris County, for Tarrant County, Dallas County. Your larger counties, the small rural ones probably wouldn't be able to do this, but in a county like Tarrant, we probably could get rid of our entire city and county government taxes for an increase of, I think it was about 4 or 5 cents, which, I mean, you're going up to 12, 13 cents on sales tax, which could be really high, but at the same time, you're getting to choose whether you want to spend that excess money. You're not getting penalized just because you live in a nice house or have appraisal values that you might not be able to afford. You can choose, and I think that's what makes the consumption tax, the sales tax, a little more equitable. As you've seen time and again, one of the most un-Texan things to me is that you get taken out of your house. Blood, sweat, and tears, paying off a mortgage for 15, 20, 30 years, and then you can't make one property tax payment, you get kicked out of your house. And I think that's the frustration that so many people across Texas, across House District 93, across other places are looking at, is that just seems so unfair, seems so un-Texan. So we want to make sure that doesn't happen to anybody. And I think at least starting the conversation of what would it look like if we went to a consumption tax. One thing we'd have to do, as Judge Whitley said, is we'd have to broaden the base of taxable goods. You'd actually be surprised at how many things don't get taxed under our current system. And I'm sure TPPF has done that. J.B. Horton talks to a lot of these people who have these luxury boats that we don't have a tax on. And maybe that's good because it spurs economic activity on something, but if it's part of a larger conversation where we can actually get rid of our property tax, and I think Vance said something that's really good. Texans don't want property tax reform, they want property tax relief, right? And a bunch of what we talked about in the 85th session was property tax reform. And I'm really hoping this next session we can actually have property tax relief. You've seen the governor's plan. You may have seen the governor's plan. He does have that 2.5% revenue cap in there. Now, I will say one of the best arguments that Governor Abbott has for that 2.5% is Tarrant County, because we haven't gone above that rate of growth, and Tarrant County is about as well run and does things about as well as I know. We even win awards for how well that Judge Whitley and Commissioner Wynn and all the other commissioners, how well they run this county, and they still don't go over that 2.5%. They haven't gone over that 2.5%, which makes it, which you can tell, you can still have a growing, thriving economy, a growing, thriving business community without going after 2.5%. And then if you do want to go above 2.5%, you can, you just have to get voter approval. And we talk a lot about local control. Well, I would submit to you about the most local control you can have is citizens voting for what's happening in their jurisdiction. That's about the most local level I can think of. So I don't think we ought to take necessarily the decision out of the hands of the people when they're deciding on those things. I know we have a larger local control, state involvement on a lot of other issues, but when it comes to taxing and things like that, I think the more input you can get from the public, the better. And so I do think that there is local control going to the people to get their approval for spending their money. The governor's tax proposal also calls for appraisal districts, the head of the appraisal districts to be popularly elected, like our tax assessor, collector, and other individuals. I think that might be good. Sometimes political pressure helps, sometimes it doesn't, but I think that's a conversation worth having. So those are a couple of my key highlights. I know I have a little bit more time, but the congressman is waiting to ask questions, and I don't want to hold him up. So those are my initial thoughts. I'm happy to answer any questions now or afterwards, but thank you all for having this. As David and Joel and I were saying as we came in here, who knew property taxes was such an important issue? I mean, it was just crazy. So thank you, guys.
Okay. I guess that's working. All right. We're going to start with some simple rules. One, this is not cable news, so you do not interrupt each other. You do not talk over each other. And two, you will be succinct. Anyway, be succinct. I will not be as generous with your time as Bill. This does not mean you have 30 more minutes. It means you have 30 seconds. The other is I'm going to ask some questions. You'll all have an opportunity to answer them. If you don't have an answer ready, if you say that I agree with Ron Wright, that is a valid answer. We're going to start with some simple truths that have been hit on already. One, growth. I thank God every day that I live in Arlington, Texas, in Tarrant County, and the United States of America, but there's a lot of other people that want to live here too. And they come from all over the United States, as well as other countries, like California. Yeah. The experts say that it is because of the great economic and regulatory environment of Texas. I think it's because we still let people use plastic straws. Never underestimate the lure of freedom. Yeah. Taxpayers, many taxpayers are upset by the ever-rising property taxes and this is important, the perception that there's no accountability for those increases. Okay, they don't know where to look, where to go, who to blame, and that undercuts the legitimacy of the tax system. Three, and we've already hit on this real well, unfounded mandates impact the budgets and taxes of local government. And last, the Supreme Court has ruled that our method of school finance is legal, barely, but it needs a lot of work. So the first question, and I'm going to go from left to right. There's been considerable discussion about local control. The judge hit upon this. So did you. As it relates to property tax reform, what is local control?
Local control to me would be for schools, particularly the principal, to have as much control over that school as possible. And for them to be able to make decisions for what the pay should be. I mean, one of the things that we really need to look at too with this whole school finance system is, can y'all hear me okay? Okay, is to look at the salary schedule for teachers. I mean, for example, quality teachers should be able to be paid more. So I think that's part of the local control argument in there. When we're thinking about the 2.5% cap, I don't really like to call it a cap, I call it a trigger, because what it does is it triggers an automatic election for the voters, and I think that does allow for the local control. It allows for voters to be able to decide, should we increase this amount? Because ultimately that's going to be more government spending in the process and higher taxes overall. So I think those are really things that we should consider to allowing more local control closest to the people it affects.
Thank you. Yeah, so I would actually agree. In Arlington ISD, because the control that we have locally right now and having honest conversations with our community, we're able to decide collectively, is this what our priority is? Whether that's on teacher spending, whether that's on facilities, different types of programs, initiatives, partnerships, et cetera. And so we're in a little bit different category with the funding formulas as far as property tax. Don't need to rehash all that, but it really is, I believe, incumbent on every local community to make those decisions for their own local community because their set of circumstances are different than maybe the one next door and different than Arlington, and maybe the approach is different. And we, as a community, I think as elected officials, it's incumbent upon us to be as transparent as possible and have the conversation with the community to say, put it out there. What do you want? What is your priority? And in a school district, that's what I tell people all the time. We are nothing but the conduit between the community expectation, between the community and the district to match the community's expectation to what that district should be doing for the students and the performance.
Judge.
I think local control is the ability to set a budget based upon what your perceived needs are for the citizens you represent. I'll give you an example. Our DA this past year created an intimate partner violence unit to help reduce domestic violence. She also created a unit for crimes against the elderly and crimes against children. Those are decisions that she made that we approved and that we have funded. We can talk about, you talk about putting a cap on there at 2.5%. Again, the devil's in the detail as to what does that mean. Matt's referred to the fact that on our effective tax rate we've been below it, and we have, but there's a lot of things that are excluded and not. So I think you have to look at that. The Vance and Texas Public Policy has also said that they want to have a minimum number of people who vote. You got to have at least 20%. That means it's going to be in a general election an even number of years because any other election is less than 10%. You also have to look at the timing because, as you well know, those statements have got to get out by October the 1st. And and our budget right now has to be done by September the 10th. So if you're going to do something that triggers a vote, now you've backed everything up, and it's going to make it very difficult.
I think those are all very valid concerns, and I think you're right. I think the devil is in the details, but I think that's where the collaboration between the state officials and local elected officials, I think we can get to it. A lot of times I think we say, well, it's just too messy. I don't know if we'll be able to do it. Well, let's just try to figure it out and get in a room and hammer these things out, and I think we can do it. Again, I go back to the local control piece earlier. Local control is great. As Senator Burton has said before, it's a tool, not a rule. So it doesn't work in every instance, but I think you weigh everything that you can. And at the end of the day, if the voters are voting on it, that's about the most local control as you can have.
Very good. Next question, I'll start with Aaron. Current rollback rate is 8%. The proposed rate in SB 2 in the last legislature was 5, and SB 1 in the special was 4, and the governor has recommended 2.5% as a rollback. What do you believe is the right rollback rate and why?
From an ISD perspective, that's a tough question because it's largely not applicable to me until we fix the funding formulas. We're already capped, as I said. We're at $1.04, and we through voter approval can go all the way up to $1.17. A cap. It really doesn't affect us, ultimately, it would potentially, I guess, result in a lower revenue. But if you put that funding formula in there, it could have a devastating effect, because there could be lower overall revenues, which means perhaps even less dollars on the state share on the current formula, and less revenues on the local share. And so are we able to even sustain the same number as we did last year? And that doesn't apply to anything towards teacher raises, as an example. So to me, from an ISD perspective, it's really important that we get the formula fixed, because it could have a very deleterious impact on it.
Early, you finished early, Judge.
I'm gonna go with where we are right now, and that's the 8%. I think once you start ratcheting it down, I think the intent there was, okay, if we can get our nose under the tent, we'll just keep ratcheting it down. And as I said earlier, I think that potentially cripples the cities and the counties' ability to attract new business and keep this economy going the way it is. When you talk about a rollback election, there are different things for the school than they are for city and counties. City and counties are based upon the revenue. With the school district, as long as you're at that 104, regardless of how much additional revenue is raised, you don't have to have a rollback. You only have to have a rollback with the schools is if you go over that 104.
I'd say the perfect number is whatever can get 76 votes in the House. So I don't know what that is yet, but, you know, because we had discussion 6%, 5%, 4% last session. I do think with the governor coming out with the 2.5% push, that's probably going to be a very strong starting point. It might fluctuate a little bit, but I really do think Texas can continue to hum along at the economic pace that we have with that 2.5%, because Judge Whitley, every time we're together, does a great job of detailing why we need these expenses. Commissioner Wynn is really good at that. Dr. Cavazos and Dr. Reich were unbelievable about talking why the school needed their bonds. So I've got a lot of faith in the city, county, and local officials who can say, this is why we need this extra tax money. Here's why we need that revenue. And I think that will be a case that they can make to the constituents. And I think it's probably going to be very appealing. If not, it gets voted down. But I still think that that's a better model.
Okay, Dan.
If you look historically, back in the 1970s, we had the Great Inflation, right? When inflation was growing double digit. And so it would hit the automatic rollback rate above 8% pretty often. Today, inflation's running around 2%, right? 2 to 2.5%. And so the other part of this is that in Round Rock, where I live, I have 6 taxing jurisdictions. It's difficult enough to keep up with one Texas legislature, much less 6 different taxing jurisdictions. And so what this does is it allows for the local voters to have a louder voice within this process. And it says, you know what, if they're going above the 2.5% or whatever that rate ends up being, that we're going to have more information about it. And maybe that's up to the local voters to be more informed. I think that's part of the process too. We need to be more educated about what's going on. But, you know, the 2.5% would be closer to more inflationary pressures that happen across the state. When you look, I showed the numbers earlier over the last 20 years of the average annual growth rate for all property taxes is over 6%. School districts is right around 5%, but you have special districts, cities and counties that are growing above 6%. And again, the 2.5% is not a hard cap. It's a trigger that would call for an automatic election. Today, the 8% automatic rollback, you have to actually have a petition. Right? It's not an automatic rollback where there's an election. You have to file a petition, get a number of votes, and then there could be an election, or there would be an election if you got enough votes. And that's also very difficult. When you have parents like myself who are taking care of their kids, trying to go to work and everything else, then you have to go and get a petition together. I mean, why not go ahead and allow for local voters to have a bigger say in the process? And I think that also brings together local elected officials with the local voters and say, look, this is why we need to spend more money. I mean, that's part of the process here, is to really have a bigger discussion about this instead of them being able to raise it up to 6%, let's say, for tax revenue growth, and not really have to talk about it to the voters. They do a good job. I'm sure Judge Whitley does that. But I mean, you know, some of them across the state do not.
Okay. Judge, we're going to start with you, and what you just said, Vance, kind of dovetails into this. The governor's plan would do away with the requirement for what he was talking about, which is the ballot petition, which everybody acknowledges is a difficult hurdle. These rollback elections are mandatory on school districts. They don't have to do a petition. Would you agree that the rollback for cities and counties, and keep in mind, those of you who don't know, the rollback is not affected, the calculation and does not include debt. It's on the M&O. So would you agree or disagree that the rollback should be mandatory on cities and counties like it is for school districts?
I really do not have a problem with it being mandatory. I hope it's at 8%. But the other thing that I will add and say to this is, we have a representative form of government. And Vance is right. People are busy. They've got jobs. They've got kids they're raising. They elect us to represent them. And one of the things that I have said many times, the people who elect us locally are not idiots when they elect us and geniuses when they elect statewide or federal type people. They're all the same people. And so it's a representative form of government, and that's what we've chosen this country to have.
Yeah. I think the automatic election is great. You know, sometimes I think that's what people get frustrated with, that it seems like the people work for the government, not the government for the people. And I think this is one of those things, hey, if we think government's out of whack, why do we have to spend all of our time, energy, resources, everything, justifying why they've done a bad job instead of them having to justify to us why they need to keep doing the job they're doing. So I think that automatic election is great. I'm very confident if it's a needed project or needed reason for that increased tax, then it'll sell well to the people. But I do like shifting that burden from the people to the government. We're working on a lot of legislation right now as well, just with the appraisal process and the protesting process, because sometimes it seems like when you go into protest your property taxes, the deck is stacked against you, and it's kind of in favor of the appraisal process. We want to shift that back around to where the taxpayer's in the driver's seat, and the burden is on the appraisal board to raise your taxes. So I'm in favor of it.
Short answer, yes. But one thing we got to keep in mind is that the automatic rollback, whatever the rate may be, it just could potentially slow the growth rate over time. That doesn't reduce the amount of taxes that you're currently paying, right? So that's something else that we need to find some key reforms there to provide real relief.
I wouldn't be opposed to it. I do think it needs a lot of discussion, though, because in our situation with the ISDs, it does it puts some constraint on us. As an example, we're very good at coming up with a balanced budget, and honestly, in full transparency, sometimes that budget officially is published as a small deficit, but we know what the valuations are probably going to do, and they're going to come in, and we'll probably end up balancing out okay. Because of the structure the way it is, we're running out of space. There's efficiencies that have been created and really our next thing is then to go to the voters. So looking at it from my perspective, what that entails is a great deal of energy and communication and working in a climate where who wants more taxes? And it's a lot more difficult a sell, if you will, to say here's why, here's what we need. And I'm not saying that that's not anything that we can't do, and we certainly would do it well, as we've proven time and time again in Arlington. But there is an extra stressor on what you're trying to do to effectively lead and effectively govern, when you also have to then really I think, potentially justify what you're trying to do to get an extra penny or two or that type of thing. So in theory, I think it's worth a conversation.
Okay.
Absolutely.
Very good. Are you about to cut me off?
No.
Well, he
I
didn't get
ask-
a chance to ask Matt the first question.
I haven't asked him a first question yet. Let me do that. All right,
That's your congressman.
That's right. Congressman gets his way. Pulling rank.
Matt,
Thank you for this opportunity, by the way.
should we eliminate property taxes in Texas and replace it with another form of tax to fund local government services? If so, what would it be, and how would you make it fair?
I would love to get rid of property taxes if at all possible, based on the reasoning we talked about before. Owning your own land, that being your land, your purchase, just seems very Texan. We have to be very careful how we do that. The only way I would know in Texas, it's not going to be a state income tax, as Judge Whitley said. You'd have to go to more of a consumption sales tax. If you did away completely with property tax, went to a sales tax, it would get your sales tax way up high to the point where does it become prohibitive? Do people start going to Louisiana and Oklahoma and New Mexico to buy their things, or do they not? You also have to worry about the rural areas that don't have a sales tax, kind of aren't able to generate the sales tax that a lot of the bigger urban areas are. What happens to them if the property tax just goes away? So I think we need to be responsible, we need to be thorough, we need to be thoughtful about it, but I am all for figuring out a way to get rid of property tax.
I agree. I think if you look at it from an economic standpoint, the most efficient form of taxation is a consumption-based tax. Instead of having a three-legged stool, you should have a one-legged stool, right? I mean, there are many, the stool can also stay up as long as there's a good foundation with that one leg, and that one leg should be a sales tax eventually. I think if we use state surplus dollars, like I mentioned earlier, you could actually buy down the portion of school M&O property taxes permanently to where you could eliminate that portion and still make sure that local school boards and principals and all of them still have the control that they have today. That doesn't do anything with the funding side. That's just on the, the distribution side has to do with the funding side. So that's where I could.
I think in theory, yeah, everybody would love that idea of doing away with property tax. Has to be a long conversation on where's that revenue coming from.
No. I do not favor us doing away that, you know, it's pretty hard to sit on that two-legged stool. You take another leg out of that thing, and I'm going to be on the ground a lot. And so I believe that what we have to do is we have to look at those two legs, and we have to look at the exemptions right now, and we have to come up to date, be up to date on that. We've got to look at both sides of that deal as we go forward. And I oftentimes hear, well, the property taxes are driving our older adults out of their home. Here's a little form that anybody over 65 can fill out, and 3,500 people in Tarrant County have filled it out, which basically says if you can't afford the property taxes in your home, you don't have to pay them. Now, does that mean they don't ever get paid? No. And and the amount that you don't pay accrues an interest at 8%, which I'd sure like to see the legislature move down to be something around market, which could be 2 or 3%. But when you hear somebody say we're forcing older adults out of their home, that's not the case. They've got an option.
Well, I want to thank the panel and thank you, Bill, for letting me moderate today.
Yeah.
You've witnessed two things here today. One, that elected officials are difficult to control. And the other, that civil discourse is alive and well in Arlington, Texas. Thank you all for being here.